young, he was wealthy, the perfect neighbor, the perfect guy.
It just looked like there was a violent struggle and there's just blood that went everywhere.
This was an act of vengeance. How much injury do you have to inflict?
We didn't leave any stone unturned. We were determined that this was going to get solved.
You have a partial footprint, a partial fingerprint. This was not going to be an easy case to crack.
Blairsville, Pennsylvania. Population 4,000.
Blairsville is so small, it's 1.5 square miles.
Blairsville's a nice, quaint town, certainly not unlike any other small towns in western Pennsylvania. People are easy to get to know.
You've got the white picket fences, friendly faces, quiet Main Street. This is Mayberry. And then there was a murder in Mayberry.
One day, the boys were at our house. It was a normal day.
Melissa Yuce's youngest son, 10-year-old Zachary, wants to borrow a video game from next-door neighbor, John Jelinek.
Zachary saw broken glass and blood coming down beside the door. He said he could see John's legs inside the door. Craig went over to John's house and he couldn't open the door. There was a window that was broken, so he put his hand through and he had to unlock the door to come in. He opened the door and John was laying there. He didn't go over to him, but he could tell that he wasn't breathing. He went back out of the house and called my dad and my brother, and then they called 911.
742, Indiana County. 742. We're sending a medic in for a cardiac arrest. 233 South Spring Street. 45-year-old male, and he's unresponsive. We're going to need you to contact Corporal Attic. The guy had a lot of blood and a broken window at the front door.
Murder is rare in Blairsville. The dispatcher suspects this may be a heart attack. Corporal Leidig is sent to investigate.
I was supposed to take my family out for dinner. I pulled up with my family in the car, thinking that, well, okay. They let the ambulance take it, call the coroner, and I could be on my way with my family for dinner. And when I walked in, immediately I knew it wasn't going to be that way. I noticed there was some blood on the outside, on the porch, on the windows. I walked up the steps, and I knew right away that there wasn't just a cardiac arrest. Right inside the foyer, there was blood all over the walls, all over the floor. And when you walk into the foyer to the left, there's a living room, and it was between the foyer and the living room is where Mr. Jelinek was laying. When I saw Mr. Jelinek and all the blood, I immediately said, everybody out, everybody get out.
The victim is confirmed as 38-year-old Blairsville native John Jelinek, a dentist in town. Don Hess, the Blairsville police chief, arrives minutes later.
It was horrific. We saw broken glass at the front door. We saw blood alongside the doorway itself. And we saw trails of blood going down the exterior portion of the one door panel.
Mr. Yelnick was laying face up. You can tell immediately that his throat was sliced, and there was several slice marks over the top torso of his body. There were footprints going out through the living room, through the dining room, out the back door. He was wearing sweatpants and a t-shirt, no shoes, no socks.
I was at a fundraiser for a local fire hall when the station called. They said, "Get to Blairsville right now. A dentist has been murdered." There was a huge crowd around the house. Then I saw all of these crime scene investigators coming out. They had booties on their feet, gloves on, and they were covered in blood. The state police were also coming in. It wasn't just local police that were there.
Blairsville's tiny force is ill-equipped to deal with a major murder investigation.
It was very chaotic going to the scene. We have an 8-9-man department. It was our first homicide.
We started talking to neighbors immediately, and they just kept talking about John Yelnick, this wonderful man, and they couldn't figure out who would want to hurt him.
I was coming back from my parents' home, and as I was going in the door, my phone was ringing. It was my girlfriend. And she said, "You better come over here, something's wrong at John's." The police are there, and the firemen, and the ambulance, and they said, "You can't go in." I said, "Well, I want to see him." I said, "What happened? Did he have a heart attack or a stroke, or, what happened?" And they said, "No, he's dead. He had been murdered."
He had several pictures, old pictures, that were strewn through the living room on the floor. Like there may have been a struggle where they just were thrown everywhere.
Within hours, investigators are piecing together possible scenarios.
It looked like his whole entire body had bled out onto every part of the foyer and the living room. It just looked like there was a violent struggle, and there's just blood that went everywhere. Even seeping down through the floorboards, it was a hardwood floor, into the basement area of where he was laying.
The scene was pretty graphic. So we knew we were going to have to lay aside any emotions that may arise to go ahead and try to find out who had actually done this.
He was young, he was wealthy, he was handsome, he was the perfect neighbor, the perfect guy.
But someone wanted the Blairsville dentist dead.
At that point, everybody was the suspect.
In small-town Pennsylvania, a dentist is found brutally murdered in his home. There's no sign of forced entry and nothing of value missing. Blairsville Police Corporal Janelle Leidig has little to go on.
I had officers walk up and down roads, looking everywhere to see if we could find any kind of murder weapon. We searched the entire house, and we just were unable to find any type of murder weapon.
But the killer had left clues behind.
There were footprints going out through the living room, through the dining room, out the back door. There was blood on the back door handle, and there was footprints on the outside going down the back door steps.
Near the body, the police make a surprising find.
On the coffee table, we found a check that was made out from the Uses, which is a neighbor of John Yelnick.
A check for $14,000 from the next-door neighbors.
Because they were neighbors, because a family member had actually found John Yelnick deceased, we had to see if there was any type of link between the dentist, John Yelnick, and the Uses.
We all had to go up to the police station that evening, and we were there till after midnight. I had decided that I'd like to open my own bakery. So I was talking to John one day, and I told him what my plans were, and he said, I'd like to help you with a down payment, because I'd really like to see that bakery started. So Friday before John passed away, he came to us and said, can I get that money back? And I said, absolutely.
We heard that he had taxes coming due, and he wasn't sure how he was going to pay them at that time, so that's why he was asking for money back, and that's why the uses were giving it back. The policeman that was interviewing us, he said to me, I think that you are hiding something. What are you hiding? And I said, I'm not hiding anything.
For a bakery?
I have not done anything wrong.
The Hughes family has repaid all but $1,000 of the loan. The police wonder whether the outstanding $1,000 debt could have led to murder. While the Hughes are being grilled, Officer Jill Gaston has the grim task of informing John Yelenick's wife, Michelle, of his murder.
The coroner was going to make a final death notification to Michelle Yelenick because she was in next of kin for John.
Michelle and John Yelenick separated 4 years earlier. Michelle now lives 18 miles away in Indiana, Pennsylvania with Kevin Foley, a state trooper.
The coroner had Michelle sit down at the table. He explained why we were there to do the final death notification, that she was still the next of kin. She had heard from relatives of John's that had called to let her know that he had passed away and that she had believed it was a heart attack. The coroner advised her that it wasn't a heart attack, it was considered a suspicious death. Before she would answer any question that the coroner was asking her, she would focus on Kevin, and Kevin would either nod yes or no, and then she would answer. I didn't notice any emotion in either of them. Michelle was very calm. I looked over at Kevin, noticed a mark above his eye. It was approximately an inch in length. It was red, swollen, appeared recent. His comment was hockey.
Is the cut really from a hockey game? Or something more sinister?
I spoke to the district attorney. He advised me to document everything and leave.
Within days of the dentist murder, investigators have two men in their sights, State Trooper Kevin Foley and next-door neighbor Tom Hughes. The Blairsville police continue to canvass the neighborhood for leads.
Well, a neighbor came forward claiming to hear arguing between two men, specifically the words, "I will never loan you money again."
We interviewed two doors up. They also said the same thing.
He moved into Spring Street, and our next-door neighbors moved out, and the weekend after they moved out, I believe it was, John came. We were friends, both in band and also the yearbook class. He was older than I was, so we weren't people that hung out together. We were friends in class.
A late-night argument over money seems to point to next-door neighbor Tom Hughes. The evidence certainly suggests the dentist was killed out of anger and hate.
Never did we ever realize what we were about to learn of how he suffered and what happened in that house that night.
This was a particularly gruesome case. When Dr. Yelenick was found, the body was brought to me.
Cyril Wecht, one of America's most experienced forensic pathologists, performs the autopsy.
In cases of homicide, we take hair and fingernail scrapings. We obviously collect any kind of foreign material that may be on the clothing or on the body. Dr. Yelenick most likely was punched first. Those punches would have put him at an immediate physical disadvantage. The perpetrator definitely used a knife. The major wounds consisted of incised wounds that came down from the face onto the neck. Dr. Yelenick attempted to defend himself. He was obviously holding his arm up and got to the door. whereupon his head was then pushed through the window pane, and that's where these extensive lacerations of the neck were sustained. This was an act of vengeance to kill and re-kill and make sure that somebody is literally tortured before their unconsciousness and demise. How much injury do you have to inflict?
John Jelinek bled to death slowly.
No large artery was lacerated. The bleeding was extensive, but it was more of a continuous oozing. This is a man who was a dentist, so he knew something about medicine. I would say that he probably remained conscious for a minute or two. There was no question that he had to realize that he was going to die.
It isn't even like it was a gunshot, and instantly he was dead. John was cut up like a deer. Like, he was cut to the point that the funeral director, when they called, said, "We're not going to be able to have an open casket."
Nine years earlier, John Jelinek had everything to live for.
John's biggest desire was to first be a dentist and then have a family and have many children.
Just out of dental school, he went back to his hometown and set about building his practice and his life. That's when John Jelinek met Michelle.
Oh, he was taken with her right away. John told all of his friends that he had met the homecoming queen.
Michelle had 2 children from a previous marriage.
So he had an instant family with Michelle's, and he dearly loved Michelle's children. But then having one of his own was utmost important to him.
6 months after they met, John and Michelle married in Las Vegas. The couple had difficulty conceiving, so 3 years later, they adopted a Russian boy they named JJ. By the summer of 2000, John Jelinek seemed to have it all, but there was trouble brewing in their small-town paradise.
I don't know exactly when John and Michelle's relationship started to fall apart, but I know it was not long after they had adopted JJ that John knew that she was seeing other men.
The divorce with his ex-wife was nasty. He was accused of sexual molestation of his own son, and JJ would go visit, and Michelle would say that he had done things.
Michelle accused John of molesting JJ, sexually molesting JJ. The police went in his office and handcuffed him, and he was working on a patient, and they took him out of the office.
Well, when your dentist is taken out in handcuffs accused of molesting his own child, that really had an impact on his reputation.
He was proud, and he didn't want family to know what he was living with, and he was ashamed because he was drinking to try to forget. He changed from this, gentle, humble, loving, giving person to this, just torn up with anger and didn't know how to vent it and didn't have anyone to talk to. Really didn't have anyone to talk to.
The child abuse charges were thrown out of court, but they reveal how bitter the relationship had become.
Dr. Jelinek was definitely ready for a divorce, but it wasn't something that was going to happen quickly.
Michelle, please. I thought you were going to call me at work anymore.
This dragged out for months and then years, particularly the finances of the divorce. In fact, he even settled on an agreement that gave her 60% of the assets. Very, very generous. But Michelle Jelinek sabotaged this agreement time after time after time. So you started to wonder, could Michelle Jelinek be involved?
By the spring of 2006, 6 days before the dentist's death, Michelle Jelinek finally agreed to the divorce settlement.
John spoke to my mother the night, about 9 o'clock, the night before his body was found. My mother said that she could tell in John's voice the difference. He was back to his old self. His voice was happy and upbeat and free. And he said, Aunt Ruth, I'm holding in my hand something that I've been waiting a long time for. And my mother instantly knew. She said, it must be your divorce papers.
4 o'clock, that's right.
And he said, yes. And he said, I'm going to move on with my life now. And he was calling to ask my mother if she would be willing to sign his divorce papers. And of course she was willing. And he said, I'll stop by about 3 o'clock.
5 hours later, John Jelinek was dead. The police learned that once the divorce went through, Michelle Jelinek stood to lose $2,500 a month in alimony.
When you have a messy divorce like this, you might have a motive for murder. It was 4 days after the murder of John Jelinek that Blairsville police came forward to say this community had nothing to worry about. But without a suspect, that did little to ease their fears.
As you can imagine, a lot of calls have been continuing to come in, and we're in a process of following up on those calls.
At a news conference, Blairsville Police Chief Don Hess says he has no suspects in the dentist's murder.
This was one of the toughest cases ever to get information on.
In fact, Hess already has 2 people on his radar. The next-door neighbor, Tom Hughes, and the victim's wife's boyfriend, Kevin Foley. But investigators tried to keep an open mind.
We were just looking into everybody.
The police checked John Jelinek's bank accounts and learned that his next-door neighbors weren't the only ones to benefit from his generosity.
He did lend a lot of people money. He would go to restaurants and leave large tips. He would buy rounds at bars.
John just gave money, right or wrong, but that was John. He's like, I have money, I don't need it. I'm happy to make people happy.
But clearly, the dentist didn't make his estranged wife, Michelle, happy. Did this deep-seated acrimony give her boyfriend, Kevin Foley, a motive for murder?
Kevin is one of the sweetest guys that I've known. We met many, many years ago when he was an adventure racer with my husband. He would do anything for anyone. He was always there when you needed him. I think that Kevin is a pretty good state trooper and really straight-laced as far as the rules and just very good.
The state trooper and the dentist's wife met in 2004, 2 years after Michelle and John Jelinek had separated.
Kevin always wanted a family, desperately. That was one of his main goals. When he first introduced my husband and I to Michelle, he was just smitten. You could just see it in his eyes. He was starstruck.
In a matter of months, Kevin moved in with Michelle and her 3 children. A month before the murder, they adopted a boy from Guatemala. Life seemed good for Kevin Foley. Except for one thing.
What has he done? What has JJ said?
There were rumors from day one that Dr. Jelinek had an enemy. Everybody in the community knew that he had an enemy.
I want him out of your life, Michelle.
Really, I'm not sure if hate is a strong enough word. Kevin Foley loathed John Jelinek.
Loathed him because of the bitter haggling over the divorce and Michelle's claims that John Jelinek was molesting their son, JJ.
Did John do to him?
So he was a possible person of interest because he was having a relationship and living with Michelle Jelinek.
Not dealt with. I will deal with it this time. I'm sick of this guy.
Kevin Foley claimed that on the night of the murder, he was playing hockey until midnight in Delmont. Delmont is a 20-minute drive from the victim's house in Blairsville. If Jelinek was murdered around 1 or 1:30 a.m., as the police believe, Foley had time to drive to Jelinek's house. The question for the police, was Kevin Foley's SUV...
I tracked all the gas stations from where he was to where he lives. He wouldn't have to drive through town to get to his home.
Surveillance tapes show a red SUV heading into Blairsville at 12:16. An hour and a half later, at 1:48, it looks like the same red SUV is 2 blocks from Jelinek's house on South Spring Street. Kevin Foley drives a red Explorer. But investigators can't make out the identity of the driver or the license plate.
I could not get anybody to confirm that a state police trooper was a suspect. We were able to confirm that Kevin Foley was put on quote-unquote desk duty, so he was not on the road, he was not investigating crime scenes any longer.
2 weeks after the murder, the first forensic test results are disappointing. The fingerprint found on the door handle in the kitchen is smudged. It cannot be traced. Even worse,
underneath John Jelinek's fingernails was his own DNA and someone else's. The state police did not believe this was a good enough sample to test because it wasn't that great of a sample. That mixing somehow compromised the sample.
2 months go by and no arrests. The 9-man Blairsville police force is feeling the heat.
The people in Blairsville are not used to dealing with crimes of violence resulting in loss of life. We had to really bring this thing to culmination.
Typically, when you get to a crime of this magnitude, you're going to call for help from the state police. But a state police trooper may be involved here. So the next step was to call in the FBI.
Blairsville asked us to look at the crime scene in general. When we got to the house in which Mr. Jelinek was killed, it had been cleaned out. So there was no evidence such as blood stains or other pieces of evidence.
And they were like, investigation 101. First the body, and then whatever the body's laying on goes out the door. There you go. There's evidence.
We had all of the photos for the crime scene. Evidence that was left at the scene that you could still see after those months were the stain used to reveal bloody shoe prints. The shoe prints were interesting in that there was one set. There weren't 2 different types of shoe prints. The victim was wearing no shoes.
So what we did was everybody who was on scene, I had them give me their shoes, and we made shoe prints of what they had on. And we compared them to the assailant's shoe prints. So once I compared everybody who was there, we found that none of them matched.
We had police officers. They were on our street, going into each and every one of our neighbors to interview them. But they went to everybody but our house. A neighbor of mine said that she saw me go out the front door, take something out of my trunk, pass it off to a car that was going by, like I had evidence.
Then I started to see the Youth family sort of pull inside themselves. They weren't as friendly. They weren't talking to the media anymore. And that's when we got an inkling that Mr. Youth may be a suspect.
In Blairsville, Pennsylvania, a popular dentist has been murdered in cold blood. 2 months into the investigation, the police have 2 men on their suspect list. The estranged wife's boyfriend and the next-door neighbor. Evidence against them is scant, but that doesn't stop the crackle of rumors.
Neighbors here played a huge role in the investigation. The police needed to know any little thing they may have seen or heard that may be a motive for murder.
The police were watching my husband jog in the morning. They were talking to our neighbors. Why are they interviewing everybody else and they're not interviewing us? Understand. I don't know, it was scary. Very scary.
Melissa's husband, Tom, isn't in the frame for murdering his neighbor just because of the $1,000 debt.
Melissa was lonely sometimes because Tom was in the military.
Yes, some of the neighbors did try to insinuate that maybe John and Melissa were having some kind of an affair.
One neighbor said that she would oftentimes see Melissa Use and Dr. Yelnick on the front porch having coffee, sharing a conversation.
Tom went away for 3 years to be in the military, and I was a next-door neighbor that sat on a porch with my neighbor.
John was lonely, Melissa was lonely. He had JJ, she had boys. They were playing together, so of course they were talking.
When questioned, Tom Use has no solid alibi. He claims he was at home sleeping. But all Melissa can say for sure is that she awoke at 3:30 and she saw him leave for work at 5 a.m. Tom Use is now a serious suspect. Detectives ask him to take a lie detector test. The results are inconclusive.
Police came in and told Tom that we wanted to know what size shoes you wear.
Tom Use's shoe size doesn't match the bloody prints left at the scene. The police turn their attention to one of their own. State Trooper Kevin Foley, the boyfriend of the dentist's estranged wife. His shoe size does fit the print left at the scene.
So here's the problem with this crime scene. There wasn't a lot of evidence, but there was definitely some evidence. Good forensic evidence that could be used to convict a killer. The question in everyone's minds, would a state police trooper, especially a skilled crime scene investigator, leave any forensic evidence behind?
And some ask, if Kevin Foley did kill John Yelenick, can the police be relied upon to fully investigate a fellow officer?
Kevin and Michelle were not really cooperating. They immediately got attorneys, and we weren't able to talk to them after that.
The person does have a constitutional right not to speak with the police. We didn't get statements from either one or photographs and things like that.
We have to get a search warrant to collect evidence unless they're willing to give it up freely.
We had heard different things about Kevin Foley's feelings about John Yelenick, and you have to be careful when you're just hearing from certain sources.
Especially when a police officer is connected to the dead man.
I wanted to make sure I was doing the correct thing, and I wanted to make sure that everyone else was ruled out first.
Corporal Leidy went down the road of John being homosexual, of John having a gambling problem, of John being a womanizer.
In fact, detectives discover that after separating from Michelle, John Yelenick had a number of girlfriends. All are investigated and all are eliminated.
They did have to go through and rule out every friend. I mean, they put his partner through a lie detector and insinuations, and they did grill a lot of people, but not the wife. The Blairsville Police Department could not have been prepared to deal with this. This thing was going nowhere, and so I called them. I said, we have to talk. Like, we're not happy. We're not happy with what's going on. You have got to get the Attorney General on board. That became my mission. And every time I could speak with Chief Hess, I was like, please, don't try to investigate this yourself. You have limited resources, you have limited manpower, and it was a concern. It really was a concern.
The family was just pushing and pushing for the state to get involved. They really wanted the Attorney General to get involved, to be aggressive, and somehow get some kind of grand jury indictment in this case.
Despite help from the FBI and state police, the Blairsville force has all but reached a dead end. The state police now take over the case, even though one of their own, Kevin Foley, is a prime suspect.
We were actually the first station to sit down with Marianne Clark about a message for her cousin's killer.
We are not going away, and we are not going to stop. We will find out who did this. It really was a concern because while on one hand we're saying we're not comfortable with the state police being here, we also weren't real comfortable with Blairsville police handling it.
It was like excruciating for not only the public but for us. We were unable to investigate the whole crime itself.
We talked to our senators, we talked to our representatives. We didn't leave any stone unturned. We were determined that this was going to get solved.
We've got to get things moving again.
2 more months pass. The state police are going nowhere fast. Finally, nearly a year after the Blairsville dentist was killed, the DA makes a major move.
And when the Attorney General's office got involved, that's when things started happening.
Prosecutor Anthony Krastik is now in charge.
The grand jury in Pennsylvania is an investigating tool where you can call witnesses in, you can grant immunity, you can subpoena records, you can actually force witnesses to testify.
Krastik and his team go back to square one.
There were great pictures taken by the state police crime unit at the scene. So we were able rather quickly to look at that evidence and see what happened, kind of reconstruct the crime. In the meantime, there was all kind of scientific evidence being done in the laboratories. The next question was, who did it?
The Attorney General enlists the FBI to reconstruct the crime scene in 3D.
You could be standing virtually in one room and then look around to see where exactly things are happening. It's as if you're in the house itself, and we've taken you there for a tour. The assailant, and there was only one assailant, got blood on the bottom of his shoes and left shoe prints on his walk out the door. They're visible to the naked eye. You can tell the size of the shoes. How could he get so bloody? And he must have gotten bloody, and then not left any blood in his vehicle.
So what did the killer do with his shoes and his bloody clothing? The Attorney General's investigation starts at the house of the dentist's ex-wife, Michelle, and her boyfriend, Kevin Foley.
Found a hockey bag. And he also said that was his only hockey bag. But he had gotten a hockey bag from a fellow state trooper. When we showed the hockey bag to that state trooper, he said, "That's not the bag I gave him."
Why would Kevin Foley lie about a hockey bag?
So clearly there was another bag that he had before the homicide they didn't have after the homicide.
For almost a year, someone has been getting away with murder in Blairsville, Pennsylvania. Now that the grand jury has taken over, the investigation picks up steam. Investigators test suspect Kevin Foley's hockey bag for traces of blood. None is found. they retest the victim's fingernail clippings for foreign DNA.
The DNA. It always comes down to forensic evidence. The problem with this forensic evidence, you had what investigators call a mixed sample.
4 months later, grand jury testimony begins. Witness after witness is forced to take the stand. Under oath, shocking news stories emerge. Stories that put Kevin Foley at the top of the suspect list.
Kevin Foley had a hatred for John Yelenick, which was almost irrational.
When he would talk about Dr. Yelenick at work, he would flick his knife open and closed and open and closed.
I'm going to be the one to teach him the lesson.
For over a year, Kevin Foley made statements about John Yelenick, how much he hated him, that he wished he was dead. In one instance, asking a state trooper to help him kill him.
I'll tell you what, you hold him down and I'll slice him.
It's looking bad for Trooper Foley. Yet so far, the grand jury has only heard suspicion and hearsay. That is about to change. Experts at the FBI are finally able to identify those bloody shoe prints the killer left behind.
The examiner was able to take the image of the processed blood-stained shoe print and match it up with a type of Asics athletic shoe.
An Asics gel creed size 10 to 12. The other suspect, next-door neighbor Tom Hughes, wears a size 13. This is the first time that Tom Hughes has spoken publicly about the case.
I had a knock on the door. It was two detectives, and they had come in, and in a roundabout way, said that I wasn't being looked at, I wasn't a person of interest, I wasn't a suspect, and then they left. And then we didn't hear anything after that.
Asics had a program where law enforcement could get a great discount on shoes. One of their best customers was Kevin Foley. And they actually had his request for those shoes, as well as the shipping notices, the invoice, and his credit card information. He had bought those shoes, and then they were gone.
And finally, the DNA results on the victim's fingernail clippings. The sample the state police rejected for being compromised.
2 DNA profiles were found in the blood under the fingernail of John Yelenick. One was his, of course, the major contributor. But there was a second minor profile. It matched Kevin Foley. So he had a fingernail-like scratch above his forehead.
Police confirmed for us that it was his estranged wife's boyfriend, Pennsylvania State Trooper Kevin Foley.
17 months after John Yelenick's death, 42-year-old state trooper Kevin Foley is charged with a dentist's murder.
Getaway car and that an SUV looked...
It was the day before my birthday, and there couldn't have been a better birthday gift than to know that he was arrested.
It probably was a week after he was in jail. I just couldn't take it anymore. I had written him a letter and he didn't respond. And so I went there. He told me, you know, that he was gonna be out really soon. This was ridiculous. And he told me not to read the papers because it's all lies. I just immediately got sick. I remember just starting to cry and saying, I can't believe he did this.
Almost 2 years later, the trial begins.
Kevin Foley testified that after the hockey match, he went straight home. That he was with Michelle Yelenick at home. Our investigation showed that he had plenty of time to go there, to his home, and still come back to Blairsville in time to do the murder.
John Yelenick's friends, his family, his college roommates, his patients were at the trial. The only person missing from that trial was his estranged wife, Michelle.
Prosecutors argue that on April 13, 2006, angry over the divorce settlement between John Jelinek and Michelle, Kevin Foley drove to Jelinek's house. He entered by the back door and surprised the dentist asleep on the couch.
I've got my eye on you now. Keep it on.
They argued. Foley punched, then stabbed the dentist. Injured and outmatched, Jelinek lunged for the front door. But Foley rammed his head through the window. Panicking because of the screams, Foley pulled Jelinek's head out, severing a large vein in his throat. It took 9 minutes for John Jelinek to bleed to death. The jury takes only 4 hours to reach a verdict.
Those words, jury, have you reached your verdict? And I said, yes, we have. And then they said, guilty on all counts.
It's coming out of the Indiana County.
And just to see Kevin's head just go down, I don't think he expected it. I really don't think he thought that's what was going to happen.
He died the most horrible death. And tonight, this is his night. We love you, John, and we miss you. We're never forgetting. The system worked.
If I could meet Michelle anywhere, I would want to know, did you ever love John? Was it ever about love? And why, if you didn't want him and didn't care about him, why couldn't you let someone else have him? I'll just never, ever get over that.
A murder conviction in Pennsylvania carries a sentence of life without parole.
I was relieved that it was over, but by the same token, hurt that law enforcement could actually be involved in his death.
I hope he rots until the end of his days in prison, and I sincerely mean that. This whole event has scarred me, in ways where I feel guarded talking about it to people. And I'm very surprised I even talked to you about it now.
The state trooper, Kevin Foley, is appealing. Michelle Jelinek now lives in Georgia. John Jelinek's estate is held in trust for his adopted son, JJ, a boy who barely had time to know his dad.